Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and beside me is Maya Clarity. Tonight we are covering a series of interconnected stories out of the Middle East that the mainstream press is treating as isolated events. They are not isolated. We're looking at EU sanctions on Iranian officials, Spain pulling its ambassador from Israel, a British Liberal Democrat politician meeting with an Israeli president accused of inciting genocide, a woman killed by shrapnel in Iraq, and a potential political crisis in Lebanon. Every one of these stories traces back to the same power structures, the same wars, and the same silence from Western governments. Let's get into it.
Let's start with the European Union sanctioning 19 Iranian officials and entities over the protest crackdowns. Now, on the surface, this looks like the EU standing up for human rights. And if you only read the headline, you walk away thinking Brussels is doing the right thing. But let's ask the question nobody in mainstream media is asking: why now? Why these specific officials? And why is the EU selectively outraged about human rights abuses in Iran while simultaneously failing to impose anything close to equivalent sanctions on Israel, which is carrying out what the International Court of Justice has called a plausible genocide in Gaza? The timing tells you everything.
Exactly right. According to Middle East Eye, these sanctions target 19 officials including figures connected to the new supreme leader. The EU's foreign policy apparatus approved these measures, and they'll involve asset freezes and travel bans. Standard toolkit. But here's what you need to understand: sanctions are not neutral instruments of justice. They are weapons of foreign policy. The EU is not sanctioning these officials because it cares about Iranian protesters. It is sanctioning them because Iran is currently in the crosshairs of a broader US-Israeli military campaign, and Europe is lining up behind that campaign. These sanctions soften the ground. They build the narrative that Iran's government is illegitimate, which makes military action against Iran easier to justify to European publics.
And that's the pattern we've seen before. Think about Iraq in the early 2000s. Think about Libya. You get the sanctions regime first, then the no-fly zone rhetoric, then the humanitarian intervention language, and then the bombs. The EU sanctioning Iranian officials right now, while the United States and Israel are actively conducting military operations against Iranian targets, is not a coincidence. It is coordination. The sanctions serve as diplomatic cover. They allow European leaders to say they tried diplomacy, they tried pressure, and when the shooting escalates further, they can claim they exhausted all other options. This is manufactured consent in real time, and Middle East Eye's reporting, to their credit, lays out the mechanics of it.
Now let's connect that directly to our second story, which is enormous. Spain has recalled its ambassador from Israel. Al Jazeera is reporting that Madrid is pulling its diplomatic representative amid what they describe as rising tensions and direct criticism of US-Israeli actions in Iran and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Spain's government is taking a position that almost no other Western nation has the courage to take. They are calling the situation in Gaza a genocide, and they are opposing the war on Iran. This is a NATO member state breaking ranks, and the significance of that cannot be overstated.
Spain under Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has been one of the few European governments willing to actually name what is happening. They recognized Palestinian statehood. They have been vocally critical of Israeli military operations. And now they are withdrawing their ambassador, which in diplomatic terms is one step short of severing relations entirely. What's critical here is the contrast with what we just discussed. The EU as a bloc is sanctioning Iran, aligning with the US-Israeli axis, while Spain, an EU member, is going in the opposite direction. This tells you the European consensus is fracturing. There are real divisions within the Western alliance over this war, and the media is barely covering that fracture because it undermines the narrative of unified Western resolve.
And ask yourself why the coverage of Spain's move has been so muted in American and British media. If Hungary or Turkey recalled an ambassador from a US ally, it would be front-page news framed as authoritarian nations undermining Western unity. But when Spain does it, when a major Western democracy says we will not be complicit in genocide and we oppose this war, the silence is deafening. Al Jazeera is covering it. Some European outlets are covering it. But the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, they're burying it. Because Spain's position exposes the moral bankruptcy of every other Western government that claims to support human rights while arming and enabling Israel's military campaigns.
The diplomatic isolation of Israel is actually accelerating faster than most people realize, and Spain is just the most dramatic example. South Africa brought the genocide case to the ICJ. Colombia has cut military ties. Bolivia severed relations entirely. Chile and Honduras have recalled ambassadors, Ireland and Norway recognized Palestine. There is a global majority that sees clearly what is happening, and the holdouts are essentially the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. The old imperial powers. The countries with the deepest arms trade relationships with Israel. Follow the money and you understand why some governments speak truth and others stay silent. Spain's move matters because it breaks through the wall of complicity among major Western states.
That brings us to story 3, and this one is a masterclass in how political elites maintain their relationships with power regardless of what those powers are accused of doing. Middle East Eye is reporting that the Liberal Democrats' foreign affairs spokesperson met with the Israeli president, who has been accused of inciting genocide. Now, the Liberal Democrats in the UK position themselves as the reasonable centrist party. They talk about human rights. They talk about international law. Their voters tend to be educated, liberal-minded people who would be horrified by genocide. And yet here is their foreign affairs spokesperson shaking hands with a head of state whose rhetoric has been linked to inciting the very atrocities those voters oppose.
This is about the infrastructure of impunity. When a senior British opposition politician meets with the Israeli president, they are conferring legitimacy. They are saying, through the act of that meeting itself, that Israel's leadership remains part of the acceptable international community regardless of what the ICJ says, regardless of what the International Criminal Court says, regardless of the tens of thousands of dead civilians in Gaza. The Liberal Democrats will issue carefully worded statements about concern and proportionality, but the meeting is the message. The meeting says business as usual. It says we will not treat you as a pariah no matter what you do. And Middle East Eye is right to highlight this because it exposes the gap between what British politicians say and what they actually do.
And let's be specific about the accusation here. The Israeli president is accused of inciting genocide. This is not a trivial allegation. This is a charge that relates to statements and actions that contributed to the dehumanization of an entire population, which then facilitated the mass killing of civilians. Under the Genocide Convention, incitement to genocide is itself a crime. So the Lib Dem spokesperson is not just meeting with a controversial figure. They are meeting with someone accused of one of the gravest crimes in international law. And the British media treats it as a footnote, if they cover it at all, because challenging Israel's political leadership remains one of the strongest taboos in British political life.
And this is where the stories start weaving together. The EU sanctions Iran to build the case for war. Spain breaks ranks and says no to complicity. And British politicians quietly maintain their relationships with the very officials accused of the crimes that Spain is protesting. You see the machinery of Western foreign policy operating at multiple levels simultaneously. The public level, where governments express concern and call for restraint. And the private level, where the meetings happen, where the arms deals continue, where the diplomatic legitimacy is maintained. The Lib Dem story is a window into that private level, and it is damning.
Let's move to Iraq. Middle East Eye reports that shrapnel from a bombing has killed a woman in Iraq, with health and security officials confirming the death. The reporting indicates this was connected to a strike on an arms depot. Now, Iraq is supposed to be a sovereign nation. The US officially ended its combat mission there. But strikes continue, arms depots are being targeted, and civilians are dying. This woman's death is not an accident. It is the predictable and predicted consequence of military operations conducted with disregard for civilian life. And her death will not make the evening news in any Western country. She will not be named. She will not be mourned on the floor of any parliament. She is simply collateral damage in a war that officially is not even happening.
The Iraq story is critical because it reveals the permanent war footing that the United States and its allies maintain across the Middle East. We were told the Iraq war ended. We were told combat operations ceased. But weapons depots are being struck, and when you bomb an arms depot near populated areas, shrapnel kills people. That is not a mystery. That is physics. The military planners who authorized that strike knew the risks. They calculated that the strategic value of destroying those weapons outweighed the lives of nearby civilians. That calculation itself is a moral obscenity, and it happens every single day across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and now Iran. One woman killed by shrapnel is not a headline to the Pentagon. It is a statistic, if it is recorded at all.
And this connects directly to the broader campaign. The arms depot strike in Iraq is almost certainly related to the escalating conflict with Iran and Iranian-aligned groups across the region. The US is hitting weapons caches, supply lines, and infrastructure that it claims supports groups like Kataib Hezbollah and other Iran-backed factions. But these strikes happen in populated areas. Iraqi civilians live near these sites. When the U.S. designates a building as a military target, it does not evacuate the neighborhood. It fires, and people like this woman die. The health and security officials who confirmed her death are Iraqi officials, telling the world that their citizens are being killed by foreign military operations on their own soil. That is not sovereignty. That is occupation by another name.
And notice who is absent from this conversation in the Western press. Where is the Iraqi government's voice? Where is the Iraqi Prime Minister demanding an end to strikes on Iraqi territory? The truth is that Iraqi political leaders are trapped between U.S. pressure and Iranian influence, and their citizens pay the price for that geopolitical squeeze. This woman who died from shrapnel is the human cost of great power competition being fought on someone else's land. Iraq did not choose to be a battleground between the U.S. and Iran. It was made into one. And every strike, every piece of shrapnel, every civilian death is a reminder that Iraqi sovereignty is a fiction maintained for diplomatic convenience while foreign powers bomb freely.
Our final story tonight takes us to Lebanon, where Middle East Eye reports that Prime Minister Nawaf Salam is considering sacking the army chief over disagreements related to Hezbollah. This is a political earthquake in a country that is already on the edge of collapse. Lebanon's civil-military relationship has always been delicate, shaped by the country's sectarian power-sharing system. The army is supposed to be one of the few national institutions that transcend sect. If the Prime Minister fires the army chief over Hezbollah policy, he is blowing up that delicate balance, and the consequences could destabilize the entire country.
To understand this story, you need to understand what Hezbollah means in Lebanese politics. It is not simply a militia or a political party. It is a state within a state, with its own military capability, its own social services, and its own foreign policy aligned with Iran. The disagreement between Prime Minister Salam and the army chief almost certainly centers on how the Lebanese military should relate to Hezbollah in the context of the current regional war. Should the army confront Hezbollah? Should it cooperate? Should it stay neutral? Every one of those options has massive implications, and the fact that this disagreement has reached the level of the Prime Minister considering firing the army chief tells you how acute the crisis has become.
And this is where the regional picture comes into focus. The US and Israel want Hezbollah degraded or destroyed. They have been striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. They want the Lebanese state to distance itself from Hezbollah and effectively side with the US-Israeli coalition. If Prime Minister Salam is considering removing an army chief who may be resistant to confronting Hezbollah, the question is whether this decision is being made in Beirut or whether it is being made in Washington. Lebanon's political class has a long history of taking direction from external patrons. And in the current environment, the pressure on Lebanon to choose a side is immense.
The human stakes in Lebanon are catastrophic. This is a country that has already endured economic collapse, the Beirut port explosion, political paralysis, and repeated Israeli military incursions. Its people have suffered enormously. A civil military crisis over Hezbollah could trigger the kind of institutional breakdown that Lebanon simply cannot survive. If the army fractures along sectarian lines, if soldiers refuse orders, if different factions within the military align with different political camps, you are looking at the conditions for civil conflict. And all of this is happening because external powers are fighting their wars on Lebanese soil and demanding that Lebanese institutions conform to their strategic objectives.
Let's step back now and connect all 5 of these stories, because the connections are what the mainstream press refuses to make. The EU sanctions Iran, building the diplomatic framework for continued military escalation. Spain breaks with that framework, pulling its ambassador from Israel and opposing the war, and is essentially ignored by the Anglo-American media. A British Lib Dem politician meets with an Israeli president accused of inciting genocide, maintaining the infrastructure of legitimacy that allows the killing to continue. A woman dies from shrapnel in Iraq, a country that is being used as a battlefield in a war it did not choose. And Lebanon's government teeters on the edge of civil-military crisis because external powers demand it pick a side in their conflict.
The common thread is this: the lives and sovereignty of people across the Middle East are being sacrificed on the altar of great power competition and Israeli expansionism. The EU's sanctions on Iran are not about human rights. They are about aligning Europe with the American war machine. Spain's ambassador recall is significant precisely because it is the exception that proves the rule of Western complicity. The Lib Dem meeting in London shows how political elites maintain the relationships that enable atrocities. The dead woman in Iraq is the human cost that never makes the front page. And Lebanon is being forced to tear itself apart because Hezbollah's existence is inconvenient for the US-Israeli strategic plan. These are not 5 separate stories. They are 5 chapters of the same story.
And what that story tells us is that the rules-based international order that Western governments claim to defend is applied with ruthless selectivity. Iran violates human rights and gets sanctioned. Israel commits what the ICJ calls a plausible genocide and gets weapons shipments. Iraq's sovereignty is violated daily and nobody in Washington loses sleep over it. Lebanon is pressured to dismantle part of its own political structure to suit foreign strategic interests. The rules apply to some and not to others, and the deciding factor is not morality or international law. It is power. It is who is useful to the American empire and who is not.
I want to return to Spain for a moment because I think their stance deserves deeper analysis. When a NATO member state recalls its ambassador from Israel, it is not just a symbolic gesture. It has real diplomatic and economic implications. Spain is signaling to the rest of Europe that there is another path available. You do not have to follow Washington into every war. You do not have to provide diplomatic cover for every atrocity. You can say no. The question is whether other European states will follow Spain's lead or whether Madrid will be pressured back into line. My assessment is that significant pressure is already being applied behind the scenes, and we should watch for signs that Spain softens its position in the coming weeks. If they hold firm, it could be a turning point.
And that pressure will come not just from Washington but from within the EU itself. Germany and France have enormous influence within European institutions, and both are deeply invested in the US alliance structure. They will view Spain's move as a threat to European unity, which in their framing means unity behind American foreign policy objectives. The internal EU dynamics here are fascinating and almost completely unreported. There are genuine divisions between southern European states, which tend to be more sympathetic to Palestinian rights, and northern European states, which tend to prioritize the transatlantic relationship. Spain is forcing those divisions into the open, and that makes a lot of powerful people very uncomfortable.
Let me also highlight something about the Iraq story that deserves more attention. The fact that health and security officials confirmed this woman's death suggests there is documentation. There is a record. And that matters because accountability requires evidence. Every civilian death that is documented, every name that is recorded, every piece of shrapnel that is recovered becomes part of the legal and historical record that will eventually be used to hold decision-makers accountable. The people on the ground in Iraq who report these deaths, often at personal risk, are doing the work of justice even when the international community ignores them. Their documentation is essential, and Middle East Eye's willingness to report on individual civilian deaths is exactly the kind of journalism that makes accountability possible.
That is an important point. The dehumanization of victims is a prerequisite for the continuation of war. When civilian deaths are reported as statistics, when they are not named, when their stories are not told, it becomes easier for governments to continue the killing. Every time a journalist reports on an individual death, with details, with sources, with humanity, they are pushing back against that dehumanization. The woman killed by shrapnel in Iraq was someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's neighbor. She had a life, and it was taken from her by a military decision made thousands of miles away by people who will never know her name.
On Lebanon, I want to emphasize the danger of the current moment. Prime Minister Salam considering the removal of the army chief is not just a personnel decision. It is a signal about the direction Lebanon is being pushed. If the army chief is removed because he is seen as too accommodating toward Hezbollah, or not willing enough to confront them on behalf of Western interests, then Lebanon's military becomes a partisan instrument rather than a national one. And once that happens, the army loses its legitimacy as a unifying institution. In a country with Lebanon's history of civil war, that is playing with fire in a room full of gasoline. The external powers pushing Lebanon toward this confrontation bear responsibility for whatever comes next.
And let's name those external powers clearly. The United States has been the primary external force shaping Lebanese politics for decades, through military aid, diplomatic pressure, and economic leverage. Israel has invaded Lebanon multiple times and continues to conduct military operations on Lebanese territory. Iran supports Hezbollah financially and militarily. And France, Lebanon's former colonial ruler, maintains significant influence. Lebanon is a small country caught between enormous powers, and its people suffer the consequences of decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, and Paris. The idea that this is simply an internal Lebanese political dispute is a fiction designed to obscure external responsibility.
Before we close, I want to address something directly to our audience. If you are watching this and feeling overwhelmed by the scale of what we're describing, that is a rational response. The machinery of war and empire is designed to be overwhelming. It is designed to make you feel powerless. But you are not powerless. Spain's government proved that this week. One nation standing up and saying no changes the calculus. When enough people demand accountability, when enough citizens refuse to accept complicity in their name, the political ground shifts. Every empire in history has eventually faced a reckoning, and the reckoning for the current order is coming. The question is whether it comes through justice or through catastrophe.
Maya is right. And here is what you can do. First, seek out the sources we've cited tonight. Read Middle East Eye. Read Al Jazeera. Read the independent journalists who are risking their lives to report from Iraq, from Gaza, from Lebanon. Do not rely on outlets that are structurally incapable of challenging the governments that fund and regulate them. Second, contact your elected representatives. Demand they follow Spain's example. Demand they explain why your government sanctions Iran for human rights abuses while arming Israel during a genocide finding by the International Court of Justice. Make them answer for the contradiction. Third, support the organizations documenting civilian deaths. The evidence being gathered now will be used in future tribunals. Justice may be delayed, but it does not have to be denied.
And finally, refuse to accept the normalization of this violence. When a woman is killed by shrapnel in Iraq and it does not make your national news, that is not an accident. That is editorial choice. That is a decision by media gatekeepers that her life does not matter enough to report. Challenge that. Share these stories. Talk about them with your families, your coworkers, your communities. The greatest weapon that warmakers have is public indifference, and the greatest threat to their power is an informed, engaged citizenry that refuses to look away. That is what Truth Report exists to support. We are here to make sure you have the information you need to hold power accountable.
I'm Alex Truth. She's Maya Clarity. This has been Truth Report. We covered the EU's selective sanctioning of Iran, Spain's courageous recall of its ambassador from Israel, a British politician's legitimization of an Israeli president accused of inciting genocide, the killing of a civilian woman in Iraq by foreign military operations, and Lebanon's dangerous civil-military crisis over Hezbollah. 5 stories. 1 war. 1 system of power. And 1 simple question that every citizen in every Western democracy needs to ask their government: why are you complicit? We'll see you next time. Stay informed. Stay angry. Stay engaged.